Um, thank you so much, Floyd, for the kind introduction. Have you got me on the big screen now? Great. I'm gonna share my screen here. Yeah. And there you go. Do you see it well? Okay, great. So what I'm going to talk about today is an ecological perspective on economic rents. And before I do that, I was going to give a quick background on myself. My background is that I originally after university worked in finance, and then after a while decided that I'm interested in architecture school, in architecture in the built environment, and decided to go to architecture school. And that's actually where I became aware of the problem of economic rents. It was not in studying or working in finance. It was very much trying to sort of create something that would be useful, and then seeing how it's very hard in a system that that is built around rent extraction ultimately. And that's why I became quite obsessed with that problem, and that's why I started doing studying a PhD at UCL here. I think a lot of us will think, well, this is probably like a green take or like an environmental take on economic rent, which is partially the case, but it's almost like a different perspective, I would think, and it's sort of taken a step back. And I like this photo sums up and quite a few people, and it's quite famous in this context. The idea that we have to look at the whole problem from the outside. And we have this picture of Earthrise, and the idea that what is actually the problem we're looking at? The problem we're looking at is a planet that happens to be inhabitable, where you have a biosphere, you have life, and some of this life are humans, and these humans create a culture and a society. And in this society, you have a significant part of the society, which is the economy. And in this subsection of society, you solve the problem of how humans can carve out a life in the ecosphere, ultimately. So there is a research field, which is essentially ecological economics, which is taking a combination of ecology, like starting out from the very physical foundation of human life on Earth, ultimately biology, and then relating it to essentially what I just said, the human economic problem on Earth. And you can see when you look at it from this perspective, that if you come in from the ecology and you go into society, and then the economy is some subsection, it becomes quite clear that why do humans do economics? Why do humans set up an economy? Because they have very specific problems. There are limited resources on this planet, and humans do set up an economy to deal with them, to solve their problems with economic institutions. So that also leads then to the question of what is the objective of the economy? It always queries the objective. It always queries the objective then, like why would you do an economy? Arguably to enhance the human condition on Earth without destroying Earth in the process. In sort of more practical terms, it's a sort of different, it entails a different perspective on what the economy is about. And it takes the same, say, physical perspective on what is the economy actually about. So if you think about the economy in a very straightforward way as a sort of human economic problem, it really consists of two things. You have to provide the things that you need to solve the problem, and then you have to take these things that you produce and you have to use them for the problem that you're trying to solve. They're two different steps, and they typically call production and distribution. And the ecological economist Inge Röpke has been using for a few years, I think, the example of a cake. If your problem is you want to feed your community, with, or celebrate an event, you make a cake. So it's always two steps. Everyone contributes materials, labor, equipment to create this cake. But then, of course, the problem will not be solved if you didn't distribute the cake adequately among the community. If, say, for example, I just then took the cake after we baked one together, then you would probably not consider the problem of the cake solved, because everyone was hoping to not finish the day hungry. Another example that goes in the same direction, that becomes a bit more technical, is the bathtub analogy, and you might have heard of that. If you think of the problem as that you might want to take a bath, the economic problem is you want to take a nice warm bath for 2 hours. What would be the key metric that you look at when you do that? Now, the key metric would probably be how much water is in the bathtub. You would not look at how much water is coming into the bathtub, and you would not look at how much goes out. You not look at flows, but you look at stocks, because the ultimate goal is ultimately to have a stock of the thing you're after, and then be able to in order to be able to use it. And this is a problem. For example, I'm working in my research on housing, and in housing, this is a very typical problem, that when we and that's also what interestingly led me to looking into this when I was in architecture school, that we were being told that we have to add so many houses in order to resolve the housing problem in a given community. But then I was asking on very ecologically sensitive terrain. But then I was asking, why do we actually know how many houses we have and how many people have to be housed? And that wasn't known. And much of the economy is very much operated on this principle that we put on the tap, and we measure the water that flows through the tap, but we don't actually look at the stocks and what we use them for, and if there's enough of it, or especially what purpose we use it for. So especially from an ecological perspective, and this is like an environmental perspective in this case, it's quite irresponsible to be running a tap to fill a bathtub, if really you could just close the drain and ensure that all the water that enters the bathtub actually stays in the bathtub and serve the purpose that you want to pursue, which is having a bath. So when you look at the economy this way, and this goes back to the introductory slides that Floyd had, is that you probably have an end game here, an economic end game, which is what we're starting to approach, that you want to have a bath that does not require any new water ever, and that doesn't lose heat ever, and that doesn't depreciate in terms of the rim, the actual bathtub. So you would want to have an economy that ideally solves your problem of having a bathtub. You say the human economic problem boiled down to taking a bath. You want to solve this problem in a way that you don't have to rely on any new flows. But the consequence of this, of course, is that it's very essential that this bath is fully filled, and that this bath actually is being used for, and that there's no drain away to other users. Now, this has all been quite sort of abstract and sort of general ideas, but this is actually something that already happens, and Floyd mentioned that in the introduction, that we'd be going towards an ownership economy, which from an ecological perspective is a very good thing, because we want to ultimately change the world into an environment that doesn't require any more resource flows from our end, or including human labor, to get the basics, to have basic survival, to have like a basic dignified life. So go beyond subsistence and create a world in which this is no longer necessary. So we want to create assets that enable sustainable well-being with minimal resources. And these assets, of course, already exist in the form of all the land, and it goes beyond that. You can include cultural capital, knowledge, scientific knowledge, and including houses. Of course, houses depreciate, but most of the people most people, or many people in London, it's most of the people, live in houses that are much older than the mortgage that financed it. So you have a lot of houses that are there, and you can have a decent, well, a decent time in them, and it's paid off. It turns into an asset that does not require much recreation, say. And of course, once you have such an asset, and this picture is from the city of Barcelona, where we had a colleague at our institute who works on that. The situation there, which is, Barcelona has a very high quality of life, and the city is working to improve it further by creating exactly these assets that we're after, to creating these assets that don't require further maintenance. Barcelona has a very good climate. You can create passive houses that essentially solve the human housing problem. The problem is, of course, once you create these assets, they become very sought after. Because if you had an asset that that can solve an economic problem without any work, without any labor, anyone would want to own this asset. Why? Because you could charge people for it. You could just own this asset and charge for it, rather than it being used for the specific purpose it was designed for. And and specifically, this is known as this phenomenon of green gentrification, or gentrification in general. Gentrification usually is a symptom of the neighborhood getting better at solving the human economic problem of housing, because you get shops, have shops, it might be walkable, but as soon as that happens, you have this fight over taking ownership of it and trying to use it for private ends rather than for solving the very problem it was meant to solve. Now, in this context, when we put up the houses here, is of course an important question here to ask. Houses are not natural. It's not already there. It actually requires work. Now, this work, of course, has to be fairly compensated. And that's where it always gets a bit more complicated, the picture. And I'll talk about that in a moment a bit more. In ecological economics, this phenomenon, or in general, I can probably say, this phenomenon is understood as the growth imperative. The growth imperative is essentially this phenomenon that I just described, that in our economy, as soon as we have an economic problem solved, there's a very high risk that the benefits from having solved the problem do not accrue equally to everyone. And everyone else who doesn't own is dependent on leveraging human labor. And of course, human labor is expensive in the sense of, we have to exhaust ourselves. We have to get a car that requires resources in order to get to a job. But we always have a problem that we have to recreate new jobs, because as soon as we solve a problem, we have the other problem at our hands that not everyone benefits from the solution. And this is in many appeareances, this problem has appeared for a long time in economic thinking. For example, in 1930, already John Maynard Keynes was writing an essay about the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. And he was suggesting that in 2030, in 100 years, the economic problem will be solved. But because at the time, there was still like a technological economic problem. There was literally not enough housing. There was literally not enough basic medicine and things like that in most parts of the world. Whereas in many parts of the world now, we are starting to have a situation where technologically, whether it's through real assets that have actually been created, or through or just the knowledge even, we have the assets to solve technologically. We have the assets to solve most human economic problems. The problem is more on the problem. The problem is that these assets are not being used for actually solving those problems. And there is a very practical example that I'm looking at in my own research, which is housing. And in housing, you have this phenomenon that the floor space that people use increases even in situations where you wouldn't expect it. And what I've put up here is the situation in Berlin, the capital of Germany, which during the early 2000s, which you can see there, was not very sought after. The German government wasn't located there yet, and generally there was actually more housing than people would actually want to use. So everyone could just use whatever they want, and there would still be vacancy. And you see there was this very low rental price of €6 per square meter. And then around the 2010 roughly, the German government started putting gathering more jobs there, and Berlin also became a bit of a startup hub. And rents in the market for housing is doubled to this point. You can see they pretty much doubled within 10 years. And very important to point out here in this context that Berlin is a rental city. Most people rent. 85%, I think it's roughly, of people rent their homes. So this is a very important metric there. It's just, it's like how in the UK or Canada, house prices are a metric. Here you have the equivalent metric of what people rent houses for. But what you can see at the same time is that even though rents have doubled, the floor space per resident has been the same. There has been a bit of a jump. It has been going down as rents went up. It has recovered recently. But very broadly, we're talking about 40 square meters. And that's a lot. Berlin is a major city. And in the UK, I think it's UK or England now, I'm not quite sure. I'd say England. In England, the average person uses 43 square meters per person. The average person uses 43 square meters, and that's including in the countryside where people might have farm buildings and so forth. So there's a situation here where where the change in market rents doesn't actually affect how much floor space people consume, which is really odd, because you would expect, economic theory tells you and common sense tells you, if market prices go up, everyone will try to, and you start having a crisis, people will start to use less. And the reason for this is, of course, that not everybody pays rent. And in case of Berlin, it's very different, because Berlin has regulated rental stock. So there are lots of people who don't pay rent. So even if the market price changed, it doesn't affect them. So the typical solution that's being proposed. Sorry, I have to drink some water here for a moment. The typical solution that's being proposed is essentially that, and the logical solution to this, if they paid market rent, if we had a land value tax, they would surrender their space, and they would scale down. And interestingly, that's of course what happens. And interestingly, that's of course also what happens, because people who are not rent regulated or recently started renting, they use significantly less. But everyone else who is already locked in into the lower rates keeps using the same space. And the same, of course, happens in other tenures as well. You have the same phenomenon in England, where people that bought a house 30 years ago, they will not be affected by the high cost of houses today, because they already own their homes. So it's fundamentally a question of, some people don't pay rent, but it's a bit complicated, in the sense of, the people who don't pay rent is a very diverse set of people. And I've put two pictures up here. One is, supposed to signify housing welfare, essentially. A person might not pay rent because the community decides they just can't pay rent, or decide to waive the rent, and they will live there without paying market rent. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, you have people who have enough money to buy the privilege to not pay rent. So they buy property. Property is fundamentally the right to be exempted from paying rent in this day and age. So you have very different you have different phenomena here, which are fundamentally the same thing. So what I'm trying to say here is that welfare and wealth, fundamentally, if you look at the basics of the situation, are situations where we said you don't have to pay rent. They come about in very different ways, but they have very different implications. For example, in the case of welfare, we tend to say there's a very vocal discourse about saying we cannot charge market rents to lots of people because they will be displaced from their communities. Of course, you would be able to avoid that with a dividend, but the problem with the dividend is that you would have to essentially create a dividend throughout the entire economy in order to allow these people to have, to actually be able to pay their rent. Because if you don't do it throughout the entire economy, you have the problem that some people might get a dividend from owning other common assets, from owning other commonwealths. They might own a social network, for example, or they might own a mine, and then they will be able to come in and pay the higher market, be able to pay the land value tax, but the other person won't. So there's certainly a discourse, like a problem on that side. But so what I'm suggesting here is that we have a lot of situations where people don't pay rent, and it is very important to actually shed light on these situations and find out why are they not paying rent, and would they be able to pay rent? And if they don't pay rent, we should probably have a discourse about why they shouldn't be paying rent. So in the sense, you can go as far as saying it's a reversal of the burden of proof, that we just assume that everyone should be paying rent. And if we decide somebody's not paying rent, there has to be a reason. There has to be a reason. And that, I think in that sense, it's extremely important to, that we have this forum here as well, in order to be able to discuss, that we start to think of these assets, that solve human economic problems, that these assets are, that we have these assets for a purpose, and that people should be paying rent for them because, we created these assets for a purpose. But we should also think about under which conditions we don't have people pay rent, because that's a condition that's very common and that already exists. So essentially, this is like the argument that the ecological perspective changes the perspective onto the economy and changes the burden of proof. It makes the assumption of common wealth. And finally, I've used this quote, which is paraphrasing both Matt Bruenig, who's talked about this in the context of UBI, and prior to that, William Gibson talked about, mentioned this in the context of the future, that we already allocate rents from Commonwealth. We just don't do it evenly. So we already have common assets, common assets and Commonwealth. They already exist. And these rents already exist. It's just, and we allocate them to people. And it's by democratic decision. We set up certain institutions, such as untaxed property, such as social housing. There are various institutions that allow people to not pay rent. But it's a completely to think of, Commonwealth as the baseline, and then reverse engineer our institution back to actually make them and make them use our Commonwealth for what we actually want to use it for. And at this, I'll leave it, and I'll put this out a bit as a point for discussion, and I'd be very interested to see what people have to say to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fantastic work, Stefan.
Thank you. I hope it's understandable. It's a lot of concepts. You always have to dig yourself out of an academic hole a little bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Chelsea, you get to lead the Q&A. I just want to say to everyone that we're gonna have an official end at on the hour, which is 3 o'clock where I am. But we'll continue for anyone who wants to stay. Typically, we have a large group continuing asking questions well into the next hour, for as long as Stefan or some of the other experts who have joined the call are willing to hang out and chat. Okay, so we'll continue with the questions now. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I am going to ask that people who have questions, go ahead and direct those into Slido. I'm going to just share that link one more time here in case anyone missed it. But we do prioritize the questions that are in Slido and also those that have been upvoted the most. So without further ado on that, the first question that we have is, could you explain the concept of at-core and the mechanics behind how a land value tax could result in less tax overall being paid?
Okay. I just jump right in, right? Or do
Yeah.
you? Okay. No. Yeah. We talked about that on the last call as well. Essentially, AFCO means that all tax comes out of rent. So the basic idea here is that people will always pay rent because you will always you always pay rent to landlord, and once you've pay rent to a landlord, after that, sorry, I see myself here. That's very I might just change the view here. Yeah, that's thank you.
I just put it back to no one.
That's great. That's much better.
Singled out.
It essentially means that you pay taxes twice if you pay rent already. So if the government charges you a tax, they will always only be no sorry. If you pay a landlord, the landlord charges you rent that you can afford based on your net income. Now, if the landlord was the tax authority, you could pay more. You could pay more. No, sorry, I'm a bit little confused now. Maybe you can put that back,
Yeah.
and I'll come back on it.
That's okay. We'll move on to the next
quite
question.
straight last time. Sorry.
And we can come back to it. The next one that we have is, how would a Commonwealth-based land value capture system affect the rise in prices and inflation? Now, I will give you that some comments came before your talk, and some questions came after. So if at any point, I will always read them as they are, regardless of what time they came. So yeah.
Well, it's a pretty broad question, right? I mean, in general, there is an emerging thinking in economics that inflation very much depends on how much people can charge for assets, right? For example, what happened in France is when we had energy price inflation recently in the wake of the Ukraine war, the French government said that we are going to buy the energy company and we're going to fix the price of energy, which of course means that inflation is lower then, because you can ultimately set the price. So a lot of the prices are set by people that sometimes have the power to set higher prices because they can. You see that also sometimes when you have petrol price inflation and the price goes up, but then the oil price goes down. But there's always a slack in the pricing that people use pricing power as well in order to keep prices higher. And there is a way in which when you have more control over common assets, you have more control over prices that ultimately lead to inflation, that ultimately inform inflation.
Awesome. This one is regarding the Berlin example. So in the Berlin example, what happened to the housing stock, quantity and quality during the same period of the graph?
The housing stock was quite stable during. So there was actually, before the graph started, there was a building boom. The building boom built up a huge amount of stock that wasn't used, and then there was essentially a stop in construction. Because nobody was starting to use it, but it was already an overhang of units. So that was essentially when it was a very, very good situation. And then towards the end, now construction is going up again. So that you build, essentially new units are being built. And this is why the example is an example of the growth imperative that I mentioned, that these new units are being built and they're being filled by people who pay the higher market rate. But this whole exercise largely leaves the existing stock untouched. So there is an addition to stock, but there is not much happening in the existing stock.
Okay. Okay, this next one is, how should you think about your stock and flow analogy when a previously non-mortgaged home becomes mortgaged again and now has large carrying costs?
How does it relate to the stock and flow? No, I mean the stock and flow I was primarily putting as a physical example, so that we have to think about, you know, the house is still there. If you remortgage a house, essentially what you're doing is you're starting to pay rent. You're just paying rent in the form of a mortgage. You pay rent to the essentially when you buy a property right, and you have this, you know, this classic example of the 30-year mortgages in America. You essentially buy the right to pay a fixed rent for 30 years. And after that, not pay rent anymore. So that's what you're essentially doing. You're entering into private contract to do that with the bank. So that's what happened, but it doesn't affect the physical stock. It's just ultimately it changes the way you pay rent on the stock and to whom. Before that, before you own a property, you can assume that you pay rents to yourself. It's called imputed rents. So even when no rent is being paid, you still are deemed, and it was much more common in the 20th century in England, I think until the 1960s, that you paid imputed rent tax, that if you owned a home, you were deemed to be charging rent to yourself, which I think is a very important precedent that we have largely forgotten about. And so essentially when you take out a mortgage, you only pay the rent that you would have paid to yourself. You start paying that to the bank instead.
Nice. I see the next question is, who is receiving most of the rents that are currently democratically being allocated?
That's the statistical analysis, I think, and that's the analysis that some of my research is on that, and I don't have the data yet. But I think that's the data that we have to have. I think that's the data that's so important, because all these rents that I think it's fundamentally a two-step process or three-step process. Like first, we have to understand that these rents actually exist, that we have such a thing, such as that there's commonwealth, and this commonwealth generates rents. I think that's the first important step. And the second important step is to actually get a sense of the scale of these rents, you know, the monetary scale, but also, you know, which assets they flow from, and, you know, the work that you of Commonwealth have started to do. And I think the third one is to understand who actually gets these rents at the moment. Because my point a little bit is that you can, and I've had some chats with Floyd before about this idea of a virtual land tax, in a way that even if you don't tax every rent and allocate it, we already allocating these rents, so we might be able to net things off against each other. But in order to do that, we would have to have a very good idea how this, you know, and of course, ultimately, if you wanted to implement this, you would have to have very solid data at a very granular level. But yeah, I think that would be a way to get to the target of allocating rents to the right people, you know, by you know, taking a shortcut in that direction, if you will.
Stefan, before we go on to other questions, could you tell us a bit about your research and what is your focus now, and what are some findings that you're excited to tell people about?
In my research, essentially, I'm looking, one perspective is looking at this very perspective to actually, you know, describe this whole phenomenon of what an ecological perspective on rents is, this whole phenomenon that we have these common assets, and that they generate rents for everyone. That is a general sort of theoretical angle. Another angle is the Berlin direction, or like what I just talked about. This idea that we have to get a handle on where all these rents are and who benefits from them at the moment, and where they go. Because some of these rents, and because I feel that there is a certain pushback when you say we have to put a tax on all the rents. In some circles, you know, their groups, they say you have to decommodify housing. We don't actually want to put monetary values on it. And I think there is a sort of midpoint where you can say that, look, we can probably have a compromise on this, where we say, yes, some of these rents we probably don't have to commodify. We don't have to probably put a value on it, because we we use them for things that we want to use them for anyway. We use them for the things that people would use their basic income for anyway, which is, you know, decent housing, you know, basic energy supply, things like that. And beyond that is much more of a consensus that you would probably want to use, that, you know, that you want to, you know, there's much less of a it's much less polemical that you would want to put a tax on them. And another thing I'm working on is how would you implement this from a institutional perspective, like the how could you have, say, ownership forms that would actually allow you to do this much more effectively? Because a very big problem again with rent taxation is that there's a lot of pushback. And in the UK, there's no property tax whatsoever. In North America, and I know it from the US, I mean, you have property taxes of up to over 2% of the assessed value. And in the UK, that just is very far off. It would be practically unheard of. But some institutions in more direct ways. There is the example of that I did mention when I was talking, but there's the example of Singapore, which is probably the country that is the most successful at using rents for the community. And the way they do that is they own all the land. They essentially own all the land and they sell it to people for a period of time and then take it back after the ownership period, and then they sell it again, which has, you know, it has some complications. But you know, it's quite interesting that it's a completely different ownership model, but it turns out to be the most effective way of collecting rents for the community. So that's another angle. That's another thing I'm looking into, like these type of ownership forms and where they exist and how you would implement them.
Thank you. We can go back to questions.
Awesome. So the next one here is, how would you address progressive taxation of land, or would all land be taxed a flat rate?
Sorry, could you say that? I think there was a break. I don't know if it was me or if it was.
Yeah, that's okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that was good.
Perfect. How would you address progressive taxation of land, or would all land be taxed a flat rate?
Well, in land taxation, like in, you know, essentially collecting rents for the land rents for the community, the general idea is that you collect the actual rent, in the sense of, if a certain common asset, a certain plot is worth £1,000 a month, then you would collect £1,000 a month. Now, in that sense, it's the market rate. But yes, what you could do is, and that goes a bit in the direction of to which I was talking about, that you might want to consider not charging rents on certain basic uses. When you talk about energy and resources, it's always slightly more straightforward, and I often use that as a sort of base case, because what you have in energy is that we charge flat energy rates. For example, we charge X dollars per kilowatt hour, but there is actually a trend that, well, you know, basically X dollars per kilowatt hour is very regressive, because for poorer people, that's a lot of money, and for richer people, it's not a lot of money. So and it undermines ultimately poorer people's well-being if you charge flat rates or flat taxes on, say, you know, carbon emissions involved in energy. So what we might want to do is to not charge these taxes on basic consumption. For example, in the city of Barcelona, what you have is progressive levies on water use, on domestic water use. So if you just use water for the absolute basics in your household, you have much lower rates. And once you have a consumption that, you know, based on your, you know, property and I suppose that people who live in your household, that is quite significant, it's deemed something that can be commodified for the community. So the water company charges a lot more, and then uses that money to essentially to to subsidize, basic consumption, But theoretically, you could of course go much higher and then say you charge the the very fullest rate and use that as and pay the dividend back to people or to the government.
Fantastic. Okay, the next one. So this is, I think, someone positing what they believe, but it kind of is a question as well. What if we capped rent at 15% of disposable income and introduced maximum wage caps? All housing would become immediately affordable. So just thought that was something I'd get your opinion on.
If we capped rent at 15%, say, of disposable income, and what was the second one?
The second part was, introduced maximum wage gaps.
So maximum and minimum income, essentially. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that it's just very invasive, right? Fundamentally, it certainly has been, it has been floated as an idea, and it's definitely an idea that exists, that in order to reduce conspicuous consumption of, again, and I keep wanting to keep reiterating it, of what essentially common wealth, like, for example, our ability to emit carbon, there is only so much we can emit. And if you have very stratified incomes, it means that some people are just taking a much bigger share of that. And so if you limited the maximum minimum income, it's just quite invasive, because, and I think, and that's why it's very important that we have a discussion, a conversation about this, because income is generally deemed to be coming from labor. So if we put a maximum on that, like a very high progressive rate of like they had in the US in the 1960s of 95% above, I think in $1.5 million in today's dollars, that you essentially put a limit on how much real assets, how much real wealth can be consumed by these people, and there's more scope for other people to afford this real wealth. But I think it's quite invasive. And the other thing about the 15%, yes, I think it's something, as a community, I think it would be something that we might just decide it's the right thing. And it's a very common metric to say not 15 but 30% of income should be the maximum that people pay. Now the problem with that is that even if we agree democratically that that's the right thing to do, it's very hard to implement, because we have very strong property rights in most countries. So if it's very hard to force a private landlord to say you can only charge 30%, because he will automatically then take, of course, the person with the highest income. So you always have a selection again by that. You don't solve the problem of who should actually be living here, who should be protected, who should not be paying rent. It goes back to that question, who should not be paying rent. Whereas if you had a system, and and that's certainly one of my sort of research focuses, looking, you have more control over these decisions, where you could find out what the community would actually want to do with their common wealth, and then put these limitations in place, because the community actually has right over these things. It doesn't have to mean that it doesn't have to mean that it's essentially all social housing and all state housing, but it would be, for example, you have models in like I mentioned, Singapore, or in Amsterdam as well. The city owns a lot of land, and in Berlin you have quite specific models where the city, the broader community, like the society, owns the land, and then rents the land to a community that, or even to private people who can do on this land whatever they like. But because the city owns the underlying land, they can always say, you will have to use this land for this purpose. You have to house X% these type of people that we all agreed democratically they should have the possibility to live here, and you can only charge them this right, and in return we charge you less rent. So because the city owns the land underneath it, the city can essentially use that land ownership as a device for just adjusting. So if somebody says, so yeah, we took this person in that we said we should take in, but they don't really have any income, and you force us to only charge them 30% of the income, then you can say, well, in return, we charge you less for the land. Now, then you can also see that that has a certain cost, of course, for the community, for the city, like society. I will distinguish now between society, like the broader city. If we decided that nobody pays rent, then of course we would have a problem. Then it goes back to the question: where are we going to get the revenue from? And it's generally accepted that most economists agree on that the best way to raise money for the community is through rents. So you can't really waive all the rents. You just have to find a way to figure out which rents do you want to raise, and which rents do you want to maybe waive, because it's very hard for people to get those rents in the first place, even if they were dividended something back.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question, if that works for you.
Yeah.
What is your view on degrowth, and how do economic rents relate to it?
Degrowth is fundamentally proposing many of the things that I've been talking about. It's essentially the idea that you would want to create. Degrowth is essentially an activist branch of ecological economics. So it essentially proposes that we should use common wealth for actually what we want to use it for. And it doesn't engage, I would say it engages less with economic rent, because there is a tendency to think that you wouldn't want to commodify these assets. You wouldn't want to put a price tag on them and dividend it out back to the community, but you would want to have sort of like a direct democracy type of thing and allocate it directly. Now, that's the one end of the spectrum, and of course at the other end of the spectrum is to say we commodify it all and dividend it back. And what I'm saying is essentially mid-position, where you would probably want to certainly get an understanding of all the rents, but even if you don't actually physically collect them, you want to still allocate them, in double transaction. So the degrowth is very closely related to that. Now, I'm not personally a big believer in the term of degrowth, because it focuses still on the term growth, which is, I think, something what we should be looking at is really what are we trying to do. Rather than growing the economy, we should be thinking about what are we actually trying to do in the economy. And there's other ways of positively defining what we're trying to do, such as well-being or sustainable well-being. That's what we're trying to do. And how can we use these rent-bearing assets to actually further this objective, this goal that we have in the economy.
Fantastic. I do see that we've reached 3 o'clock. I'm just going to put in the chat the survey link. So if you do have time, please take a moment to fill out that survey. But Stefan, if you have a little bit more time, would you have some more time to answer questions if people still have them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll stay on for a while and go ahead and continue to ask questions to Stefan and continue recording his answers. But I just wanted to mark the official end of the official meeting, and now we're just on to the fun above and beyond question period for those interested. So all of the people still on here are the real hardcore ones now. But
thank you.
Fantastic. Awesome. And terrific presentation, by the way. Thank you so much for that. But we'll continue to ask questions. I just wanted to mark that time. So awesome. So the next one that I have is, how does this ecological perspective say about pausing the bath taps for a while, such as a slowdown or calming of extraction, relate specifically to the economic rents?
How does it specifically relate? Okay. So basically we have a problem with these acids. Like this acid that we're after is like this bathtub that doesn't lose heat, it doesn't lose water, and it doesn't disintegrate. And the problem with these bathtubs is that is something you would want to own. That's something, and because if you owned it, in the extreme case, in the extreme case, if you owned it, you could charge money for the very fact of owning it. It doesn't require any labor. The bathtub would turn into land, if you will. It's just there. In that sense, and that's a big risk, that the closer we get to solving the human economic problem, the bigger risk we have of these assets that we collectively create being hijacked for other purposes. And the most obvious thing to, if you get your hands on such an asset, is to charge other people for it, because they're going to pay a lot, because it solves the fundamental human economic problem. So that's how it relates. I hope that answers that.
Fantastic. Okay, the next one. Why is charging everyone rent preferable to not charging anyone and instead using other tools to dictate access and use?
Look, I think that it's sort of you would want to ultimately have a mixture, because it's very unlikely that we're going to have an economy without money, and it's very unlikely that we would be able to perfectly socialize all commonwealth and collect all the rents. So we're very certainly going to be somewhere in the middle. And in that case, I think there's always going to be a need for the community to raise money, and there's always going to be a need for people to have money and to raise money, and there's always going to be a situation whereby some people, because we just cannot, there's always going to be some commonwealth that's not going to be controlled. So there's always going to be a problem that we cannot fully rely on it. But on the other hand, we have an economy with money, in which money plays an important role. So we also have to have that mechanism. So I think they're essentially complements. And I think, yes, in the ideal case, both would work. But in reality, we have a mixed model. And I think we have to just use the perspective. I think use the perspective that we have, rent-bearing commonwealth. But then use different tools for allocating it, different institutions, different mechanisms.
Awesome. I think we're going to take a question from Jim Mulvale. So Jim, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for a really interesting talk, Stefan. I'm just struggling with, I guess, what you might call the politics of taxation and implementing, how to implement and make politically marketable, I guess, some of the really good ideas you're talking about, particularly here in North America. There's when you start talking about property tax, it brings out people's most libertarian tendencies. This is my money, and this is my house, this is my land, and my government should just keep its hands off, especially my local government. And not everybody thinks that way, but a lot of people do, and they think that way pretty strongly. So, so I guess, how do you I guess I'm asking myself, how does one begin to break down that ideology? And maybe, we've got this notion that property is owned simply and exclusively by individuals, the fee simple model. And then, we've got the other model, which is frequently presented as a boogeyman, the government owns everything, right? So are there sort of ways of owning property and occupying and using buildings that's between those two extremes that might give us openings to have intelligent discussions about different ways of doing this, co-op ownership of land and property, or local government ownership with different usage models or something? I'd just be interested in your thoughts along those lines. Thanks.
Yes, that's very interesting, and that's one of the key things I'm working on trying to put trying to understand, because ultimately we have these two extremes where the government model is essentially a model where we think that we can resolve everything, and we just dictate it top down, and it has a very, very bad reputation. And there was a sort of backslash then where we say, we were just, individuals can solve it, and just give them their private property and they will solve it. And I think there is a sort of mid model. I think it's very important to understand why people insist so much on this private property ownership. So what's the part of this model that's so important to people? And I think it has to do with the fact that, going back, taking this ecological perspective, that a very big human economic problem is that you want to have an absolutely safe stake in your community, and you want to have absolutely be sure that you have this roof above your head, and you don't want anyone to mess with that, and you don't want to be subject to negotiation. In property is essentially doing that. But on the other hand, of course, by taking property, and I was trying to show that with my slide on, how wealth and welfare are similar. By taking property, you essentially claiming part of our common wealth. And I think what we should, that's perhaps the argument, we should change the burden of proof. We should start having a discussion about, first there's commonwealth, and then we absolutely understand that the absolute human need to be in control of your environment and to not be displaced. So we grant you this right, but I think it has to sort of be understood, and you were asking for the narrative and the more fundamental thinking in this. I think it has to be understood that this is fundamentally commonwealth, and we give individuals very important rights to not be displaced, something like citizenship, ultimately. Like, you have the right to a share of the commonwealth, absolutely, and you have the right to the home in a place that's important to you, and that's going to be your property, if you will. But to go away from this perception that property, it starts with property, and then we come and claim that your property is commonwealth. No, it's the other way around. It was commonwealth before it became your property, and the property is a way of allocating the commonwealth. I think would be my take. And then you have specific models that do that, and the example of in Berlin, for example, where you have starting to have situations where the city owns the land and then leases it to groups of people, but always with certain strings attached. Or in Amsterdam, they've now started, in Holland, they've started to force to sell land to give people homes, but they say you have to use it as your own home, and you can't live on what I don't know, that's a rule, but theoretically you could say you can't live on 300 square meters if everyone else doesn't have a home. So you put certain limitations that just controls more, or you say you pay property tax up to 30% of your income, theoretically, or if you can't pay it, then you don't have to pay it because you're part of the community, and if you can't pay it, then but then also please don't use so much space, or but you have more control over it, and it combines the two approaches in a way.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Fantastic. We're down to our last 6 questions, so I'll try to get through these. But the next one is a rent exactly like an owed or assigned quantity of value?
Is a rent
is a rent, in quotes, exactly like an owed or assigned quantity of value?
Does rent correspond to like a specific value, you say? Or
I believe so, yeah.
Like is rent it's sort of equivalent to use value? No, I'd probably say in the very extreme case that all rents were allocated, there's a very extreme theoretical case where if we literally had all commonwealth in common, control over all commonwealth, and we literally dividended it all out, and everyone had their complete dividend, then you could argue, there's still some caveats here, but then you could argue, okay, everyone's got the same. Now, if you value something and everyone's got the same amount of tokens, it corresponds pretty much to how much you actually value it. Now, if you have a situation where some commonwealth is not actually dividended out, but is privately owned, then these people have more of these money tokens. In which case, if we have an auction for a house, and I come in with my tokens that I receive from the dividend, and the other person comes with the dividend and also owns rents from other commonwealth that they own privately, you see, like, we might value it the same, but I can't have the same amount of money because I just don't get my fair share of the dividends. So that's where where you have a limitation of that. But it's an extreme case. Ultimately, I think I've started to think about rents as sort of ultimately like a it's an instrument. It's ultimately an instrument. If you commodify the Commonwealth, yes, that's the money that you get and that you pay out, but it doesn't necessarily correspond to the value.
I see a clarification that it was housing rent versus economic rent, and that there's some confusion between the terms.
Oh, when you pay rent and
yeah,
on a house. Well, economic rent has its own technical discourse. Ultimately, economic rent is basically, the naked income for ownership. You can basically break it down to that you can charge for, going back to the bathtub or these wonderful assets that we created, that solve the human condition, so solve the human economic problems. Economic rent is you own it and you get paid for it. Whereas housing rent is what you pay for the home. Now, when you pay rent to a landlord, you pay for various things, of course. So you would also pay, for example, for things that the landlord actually has to work for. So you have to, for example, maintain a home. You have to repair it, and you have to heat it or whatever you have to do. It's not one of these perfect assets. It requires input, including by the landlord. So there's a small, obviously in housing, it's mostly economic rent and largely economic rent. But of course, housing, especially houses, have to be maintained. So there is a certain degree of sort of depreciation and labor, and it has to constantly be reconstituted, the housing asset. So
fair. Thank you for that. So the next one is, in your own words, why should economic rents be considered commonwealth, shared as equally as possible?
I think it's almost by definition, because if it didn't come from Commonwealth, I mean, what makes it Commonwealth is, or what makes it rents is that it comes from Commonwealth ultimately. That because it's something that is, it doesn't require any more work. It's there. It's already there. You say, the bathtub example, in which case nobody can claim that they get it in return for their efforts. And so in that sense, I think it's sort of it's intricately related, the two concepts.
Awesome. Okay. Would utilities like wireless networks and railroads be considered commonwealth?
Yes, I think it gets, and that's why in my own research I focus on land rents, because land rents is a more obvious example, where it's very obvious that you have a situation that's pretty much doesn't require human input because it was created by nature. Whereas you have other situations where it requires human effort. And I think it's very important to incorporate that. And I think that sort of ties a bit into also what I was talking about earlier, that you have to know where these rents are also coming from. For example, if you set up a great business, a digital platform, say, and then immediately and it becomes a structural feature of the economy. Everyone uses it. Everyone says, I'm going to Google that instead of I'm going to search it. It becomes a structural feature of the economy. And if you then go and say, oh, sorry, this is Commonwealth, I have to now put a full tax levy on it, then you demotivate people from doing this. It's this basic idea of innovation, rents from innovation. There's a recent paper by our institute has come out 2 months ago. No, it's even more recently, about it's very important to acknowledge that there are actually returns to ownership, which are actually a good thing. And of course, if you have a human-made asset, there are people working at these companies and they keep recreating the asset and they keep making it work. So it's not something that just exists by itself. And it's very important to acknowledge that, and that to make sure that their labor is not rent. They're actually facilitating this thing. And you know, if you can't lay a claim on it in that sense. You can lay a claim on the net, say, if you can then use this network to charge a lot of, you know, high prices on everyone else, then yes, you have an element of economic rent in it. But of course, there's also a base load where, you know, also the base load of the landlord, which is much smaller, of course, but there's a base load of effort that is required to maintain many assets.
Awesome. Okay, we're down to our last three. So the next one is, can you say more about how creating common assets can lead to John Maynard Keynes' prediction of 20-hour work weeks and no poverty by 2030?
Right. Essentially, what he was saying, if you remember the slide with the cake, about production and distribution, making the cake and distributing it, what he, I think, was mostly referring to is that we will have solved the economic problem of baking the cake by 2030. And I think we're on track for that. But the problem is very much that we haven't resolved the problem if we keep having to create new jobs for people in order for them to sort of go back and be able to buy a piece of the cake. If we already have the cake, if the cake's already there, say we created this cake that we can just keep using now. So Commonwealth from other people.
I think you froze for a sec, just like
what is
Froze
that?
for the last 5 seconds.
you froze for just a couple seconds there, so we might have missed part of your great ideas.
Okay, I might say the last bit again. What I'm saying is that if you are not going to have 15-hour work weeks and things like that, if people are essentially being forced to go earn money to go back to buy their share of the Commonwealth from somebody else, only if you resolve the problem of the Commonwealth, you can actually then enter into a phase where you can reduce labor to the labor that's actually necessary to maintain the Commonwealth, rather than for people to earn money to survive.
Awesome. All right, the next one. Can the difference between commonwealth and public wealth be clarified?
From my perspective, I would say that commonwealth is something that precedes public wealth in a way. That commonwealth is something that's inherently there. Like what I was trying to say with the last quote there, that we create all these assets, and that's a real physical wealth that we already have. That's there. And I think of public and private wealth more in terms of the ownership and the governance, whereas I think of commonwealth more of something, like closely related to the concept of rent, ultimately, something that is there for the way the economy works physically, say, and then some of it we might operate as public wealth or as private wealth, or it might be publicly or privately owned. I think commonwealth for me is a sort of broader, sort of deeper concept.
Fantastic. All right.
That was my introduction slides, and very similar, another take on it. Public wealth is just government-owned property, roads, companies, utilities. Can include things created by people and things that were in nature. Versus commonwealth is the value inherent in the earth that comes before human created work, that or value created by people in the form of platforms or licenses and things that we create, where we create monopolies. That part of the value belongs to people. It would not be public wealth. Yeah.
Yes. And for the first time in one of these calls' histories, I have made it to the final question. So our final question today is, in your personal view, who should not be paying rent?
In my personal view, who should not be paying rent? Well,
I love that question to end on too.
Who should not be paying rent? That's tricky. It's essentially making the claim of being able to sort of be able to make the judgment that a sort of citizens' assembly would be able to make, right? I think at the very minimum, you shouldn't be paying rent on or you should get automatic credit for the rent you would have to pay on just your basic survival, say, like the basic to have a decent, not even survival, like for having a decent life, for being able to participate in society, including housing, food, energy, things like that. I would say, and yeah, I think beyond that it becomes a different conversation. But at the very minimum, I think everyone should have a fair ability, the fair chance to be able to participate in society.
Fantastic.
Which comes back to the mission of UBI Works and Commonwealth.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
So
Well, those
Stefan,
were all of our Slido questions. So thank you so much.
Stefan, when can we expect your next publication?
I'll hopefully over the course of this year. These things always take a while, like the proper technical publication. But these things is always a long process.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And for those who are left in the call, we are working on an update of our own Commonwealth rents paper for Canada. It'll be a significant update of the land rent section in particular, as we have come across some new economics that give some different numbers and have different implications for the pricing of housing. So we'll probably send an email about it next week. And but the basic idea is that when you tax something, its value decreases. And we could actually see an overnight drop in the value of housing and land, which a lot of people want and need. And that's now going to be modeled or at least mentioned in the paper. So yeah, thanks everyone, and hope to see you on June 22nd for the next community call with Brent Rinaldi about Commonwealth dividends.
Thank you. It's great talking to you, everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye.